The sirens began at 12:20 a.m. on August 26, 1940. Their wail tore through the warm summer darkness above Berlin. Across the capital of the Reich, Germans jolted awake, sitting upright in their beds, confused and disoriented. Air raid sirens in Berlin. For many, the only logical explanation was that it had to be a drill. It had to be a drill. Hermann Göring himself had promised them again and again, with unwavering certainty. No enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. If an enemy aircraft ever reaches the Ruhr, Göring had proclaimed the year before, his chest heavy with medals, his face flushed with confidence, then my name is not Hermann Göring. You may call me Meyer, Meyer, Meyer. It was a common German surname, but also, and this was the cruel joke, the ultimate humiliation, a stereotypically Jewish name. For the Reichsmarshal of the Third Reich to declare, "Call me Meyer," was to stake his reputation, his honor, his very Nazi credibility on the absolute invincibility of the Luftwaffe. And he had not said it once, but repeatedly. About the Ruhr, about German cities, about Berlin itself. The German people believed him. Why wouldn't they? The Luftwaffe had crushed Poland, wiped the Dutch and Belgian air forces from the sky, and helped bring France to its knees in a matter of weeks. German air superiority seemed undeniable, as solid as the stone and concrete of the new Reich Chancellery. But now the sirens screamed. Searchlights slashed upward into the clouds. Anti-aircraft guns thundered in the distance. And somewhere above the darkness, British bombers were approaching the capital of the thousand-year Reich. The promise had been made from a position of total confidence. In the summer of 1940, after the fall of France, Germany appeared unstoppable. The Wehrmacht had conquered Western Europe with stunning speed. Only Britain remained. Isolated, defiant, and seemingly powerless. Hitler expected the British to negotiate, to accept reality, to recognize German dominance. Instead, Winston Churchill refused. "We shall never surrender," he told Parliament. The words sounded bold, even dramatic. But to Hitler, they rang hollow. What, after all, could Britain truly do? The answer, Hitler and Göring concluded, was simple. Destroy the Royal Air Force, seize air superiority over the English Channel, and prepare for invasion. Operation Sea Lion, the planned amphibious assault on Britain, depended entirely on control of the skies. The Luftwaffe, with more than 2,600 aircraft, faced RAF Fighter Command, with perhaps 700 operational fighters. The numbers seemed decisive. Göring confidently assured Hitler that it would take 4 days to cripple the RAF in southern England, and 4 weeks to eliminate it entirely. The assault began in earnest in mid-July 1940. German bombers, escorted by fighters, struck British shipping, coastal targets, and then RAF airfields. The strategy was logical and ruthless. Destroy the RAF. In the air and on the ground, wreck its infrastructure and leave Britain defenseless. And at first, it worked. Through late July and August, Fighter Command was being worn down relentlessly. Pilots flew 4 or 5 sorties a day, landing with hands trembling from exhaustion, only to climb back into cockpits before their aircraft had cooled. Airfields were cratered, radar stations were damaged, aircraft production struggled to replace losses. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, watched his force bleed toward collapse. Yet Hitler had issued a strict order. London was not to be bombed. Not yet. He wanted to preserve the option of negotiation, to avoid provoking British retaliation against German cities, and to maintain what he imagined was moral restraint. The Luftwaffe was to strike military targets only. Airfields, factories, ports. London, the great civilian heart of Britain, remained officially off limits. Then, on the night of August 24, 1940, that Order was violated. German bombers, perhaps lost, perhaps confused by darkness and British defenses, dropped their bombs on central London. The damage was limited, but the symbolism was immense. British civilians had been killed in their capital. Churchill, who had been waiting for precisely such a moment, responded immediately. He ordered retaliation, not against military installations, but against Berlin itself. The RAF had been conducting limited raids against German targets for months. Industrial sites, transport hubs, military facilities. But Berlin had remained untouched. It was distant, heavily defended, and symbolically powerful. Now Churchill demanded that Bomber Command reach the German capital, regardless of cost. If Germany would bomb London, Britain would bomb Berlin. The strategic value was debatable. Britain's twin-engine bombers would struggle to reach Berlin with meaningful bomb loads. Losses would be high, but the psychological impact would be enormous. On the night of August 25th, 81 RAF bombers lifted off from bases across England and headed east over the North Sea. Most were Wellingtons and Hamptons, sturdy but slow aircraft, each carrying roughly 1,000 pounds of bombs. Navigation was difficult. The distance was extreme. German defenses were largely unknown. Many aircraft turned back with mechanical problems or lost their way in the darkness. But 29 bombers reached Berlin. When the sirens sounded, Hildegard Knef, a young woman who would later become a famous actress, was asleep in her apartment. The sound felt unreal, almost impossible. She went to the window and watched searchlights sweep the sky. She heard the distant thunder of flak, and then the unmistakable thud of explosions. Not close, but close enough. Somewhere in Berlin, British bombs were falling. The raid lasted for roughly an hour. Bombs fell scattered across the city, striking residential neighborhoods in the northern and eastern districts, damaging a railway line and hitting a dairy. The physical destruction was limited. No one was killed in this first attack on Berlin, but the psychological impact was profound. Germans emerged from shelters stunned, angry, and disoriented. How could this have happened? Where was the Luftwaffe? Where were the defenses they had been promised? The capital of the Reich had been violated. William Shirer, the American journalist stationed in Berlin, recorded the mood in his diary. The Berliners are stunned. They did not think it could happen. The following morning, he watched residents gather in the streets, staring silently at the damaged buildings, speaking in hushed, uncertain tones. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry moved quickly to control the narrative. The raid, officials insisted, was insignificant. Only a handful of bombs had fallen. No important military targets had been hit. The British, they claimed, were wasting their effort. But propaganda could not conceal the truth. British bombers had reached Berlin. Hermann Göring's promise had been broken. Göring himself was not in the capital when the bombs fell. He was at his estate, Karenhall, north of Berlin, surrounded by looted art, lavish furnishings, and even pet lions. When word of the raid reached him, he reportedly erupted in fury, blaming Luftwaffe fighter commanders, demanding explanations, searching for someone to hold responsible. The explanation, however, was painfully simple. Berlin lay at the extreme range of British bombers. But it was not beyond reach. The city's air defenses, though formidable, were not impenetrable. And the RAF, desperate and determined, was prepared to accept losses to strike back at the heart of the Reich. The British returned on August 28th. This time, bombs fell closer to the city center. One exploded near the Brandenburg Gate. Another landed not far from the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's headquarters. Hitler was not present, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Britain could strike at the core of Nazi power. More raids followed on August 31st, September 1st, and September 3rd. Each attack caused limited physical damage. The RAF simply lacked the capacity to deliver heavy bomb loads over such distances. But each raid inflicted a deeper wound to German confidence. Every explosion contradicted everything the German people had been told. Berlin was not untouchable. Hitler was at the Berghof in Bavaria when the first attacks occurred. He returned to Berlin in early September. Those who saw him described a man consumed by cold, controlled fury. The British had bombed his capital. They had humiliated Göring. They had made the Reich appear weak, and they had done it deliberately. On September 4, 1940, Hitler addressed a crowd at the Sportpalast in Berlin. The audience consisted largely of women, nurses, social workers, party officials. The speech was broadcast nationwide. At first, Hitler spoke calmly. Then his voice began to rise. When the British Air Force drops 2 or 3 or 4,000 kilograms of bombs, he shouted, then we will drop, in a single night, 150, 230, 300, even 400,000 kilograms. The crowd erupted. Hitler pressed on, his voice sharpening with rage. When they declare that they will increase their attacks on our cities, then we will erase their cities from the map. The hall exploded with applause. Women wept. Arms shot upward in salute. Hitler fed on the energy, his voice cracking as he shouted, "We will put an end to the work of these night air pirates. So help us God." "The hour will come," he cried, "when one of us will break, and it will not be National Socialist Germany." The crowd roared back, "Führer, we follow you." The decision had been made. Hitler would answer British bombs with devastation of his own. He would punish Britain for its defiance, restore German pride, and begin with London. On September 5th, the order reached Albert Kesselring, the Luftwaffe Field Marshal commanding air operations in the West. The directive was unmistakable: halt attacks on RAF airfields and shift all available bomber forces toward the British capital. London was now the primary target. The objective was no longer the systematic destruction of Fighter Command's infrastructure. Instead, the goal became psychological: to shatter civilian morale, to unleash such suffering and chaos that Churchill's government would collapse under the strain. Kesselring, a professional soldier, immediately understood the consequences. For weeks, the Luftwaffe had been steadily wearing down RAF Fighter Command. British airfields in southern England were close to collapse. Some were nearly unusable. Hugh Dowding's pilots were exhausted, and losses were approaching unsustainable levels. Fighter Command, Kesselring knew, was perhaps 2 weeks from breaking. Had the pressure continued, had the Luftwaffe persisted in striking airfields and radar stations, Britain's air defenses might have failed entirely. Without air superiority, invasion became a real possibility, but Kesselring served a dictatorship. Orders were orders. Hitler had spoken, and Göring, desperate to salvage his damaged prestige, eagerly supported the shift. The Luftwaffe would bomb London. On the afternoon of September 7, 1940, Londoners heard a sound unlike anything they had known before, a deep, rolling thunder that seemed to rise from every direction at once. More than 300 German bombers, escorted by nearly 600 fighters, approached the city in broad daylight. The formations darkened the sky. RAF fighters scrambled to intercept, but the sheer scale of the attack was overwhelming. The bombers pushed through and reached their targets, the docks and warehouses of the East End, surrounded by tightly packed working-class neighborhoods. Bombs fell in waves, high explosives followed by incendiaries. The docks erupted in fire. Flames raced through streets of wooden row houses. Warehouses burned uncontrollably. By nightfall, much of eastern London was ablaze, the inferno visible for miles, a blazing marker for the next wave of bombers that arrived after dark. The assault continued throughout the night. When morning came, more than 400 Londoners were dead. thousands lay injured. Tens of thousands had lost their homes. The Blitz had begun. For the next 57 consecutive nights, German bombers would return to London. Other British cities soon joined the target list: Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester. By the time the campaign finally ended in May 1941, more than 40,000 British civilians would be killed. The destruction was real. The suffering was immense. But RAF Fighter Command, given precious breathing space by the shift, away from its airfields, survived. Damaged bases were repaired. New pilots completed training. Aircraft production continued. And the Luftwaffe, focused on terror bombing rather than strategic military targets, began to waste its strength. Bombing cities at night proved far less effective than crippling airfields in daylight. Losses remained high, but the strategic return was minimal. Hugh Dowding, exhausted and increasingly criticized for his defensive tactics, would be removed from command in November 1940. Yet his strategy had succeeded. Fighter Command had endured. By late September, it became clear that Germany would not achieve air superiority over Britain. Operation Sea Lion was postponed, and then quietly abandoned. The invasion would never come. The Battle of Britain was over. Britain had survived, not through superior numbers or overwhelming technology, but by enduring long enough for Hitler to make a catastrophic mistake. That mistake had been born of pride, anger, and wounded ego. It had been triggered by Hermann Göring's broken promise, by German arrogance, and by the need to respond to British bombs falling on Berlin. As the Blitz continued and the strategic situation stabilized, German military leaders slowly began to grasp what had truly happened. The decision to shift from airfields to cities had not been strategic. It had been emotional. Hitler's fury had overridden military logic. Göring had supported the change to protect his reputation. And the Luftwaffe had paid the price. In his post-war memoirs, Kesselring was measured but unmistakably clear. The decision to change targets, he wrote, had been a mistake. The RAF, he acknowledged, had been on the verge of collapse. "We had them," one Luftwaffe officer later admitted, "and then we let them go." Göring never publicly accepted responsibility for the failure of his promise. Instead, he blamed Luftwaffe fighter pilots for failing to protect bombers, blamed British luck, blamed circumstances. Everything except his own overconfidence. Privately, however, his influence with Hitler began to erode. The Reichsmarshal, who had sworn that no bomb would ever fall on Berlin, had been proven wrong. And in the Third Reich, being proven wrong by the Führer's enemies was unforgivable. For the German public, life under air attack gradually became a grim routine. Berlin would be bombed again and again as the war progressed, each raid growing heavier than the last. By 1943, RAF Bomber Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force would drop thousands of tons of bombs on German cities in single operations, making the first scattered raids of August 1940 seem almost insignificant by comparison. Germans learned to sleep in shelters, to move through shattered streets, to live with constant fear. The promise of invulnerability faded, forgotten by some, remembered by others only as a bitter joke. "Call me Meyer," Göring had said. By the final years of the war, with German cities in ruins and the Luftwaffe shattered, some Germans did call him that quietly, with resentment and bitterness, a reminder of the hubris that had helped cost them everything. The irony was complete and cruel. Hitler had ordered the bombing of London to avenge the bombing of Berlin, to restore German pride, to punish British defiance. But that rage-driven decision had preserved Britain's air force and destroyed Germany's best chance to invade. The bombs that fell on Berlin in August 1940, scattered, ineffective, causing little physical damage, had set off a chain of events that altered the course of the war.